All right. It is 2 o'clock in the East, 1 o'clock Central. My name is Joe Aiello. I am the field coordinator for the Rail Passenger Association. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We have a packed webinar today. And so here's real quick our agenda on the screen. We're going to get it kicked off with Jeans-Gail, our Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy. So Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I know there's a lot of excitement with the big passage of the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which was signed into law at the White House just this Monday. So we didn't know planning this webinar where we were going to be in this process, but we really couldn't have planned it better. I know it's been a long and confusing process. It started really 2 years ago when we started talking about reauthorization. It got wrapped up into Infrastructure Week, which first was kind of this meme, this joke, and then all of a sudden got really serious. But it's gone through a number of different iterations. A number of different proposals have been floated out there. I know there's a lot of confusion about what was passed, what was signed into law on Monday. And so we are very fortunate to have Devon Barnhart, director of OneRail Coalition, of which we are a member. They represent the diverse points of view and interest in the rail industry. Devon is a lawyer and civil engineer with a depth of experience on transportation policy. She joined OneRail in 2019, took over as director earlier this year. And she has also served as the subcommittee staff director for the Transportation Safety Subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee, and played a central role in the drafting and passage of the FAST Act. She was previously director of government affairs and outreach for Smart Growth America. So she really checks that trifecta of having been in Congress, seeing how the sausage is made. She's been an advocate. And now she kind of represents a number of industry voices. So she's going to help us kind of understand what happened, what the field of play is now that this bill is law. And then we're going to field some questions from y'all. So please submit your questions in the chat box once we get to the Q&A portion. And now I'm going to hand it over to Devon. Thank you for joining us.
Hi all, I'm so excited to be here. I think I have a presentation that's coming up so I can share some slides about OneRail. If you can go to the next slide. So just to flag, I'm Devon Barnhart. Again, I've worked on the Hill forever. I've been a civil engineer. I've worked on for state DOTs, and but really am passionate about the federal policy area and particularly around rail. OneRail is made up of the whole host of folks that are interested in rail, largely at the federal level. So it's the freights and passengers, all the labor unions, and then suppliers, engineering companies. That's a whole world of folks. And so OneRail is a really fun place to work, but also sometimes our members are actively fighting with each other. So we don't always have an opinion on everything, but we're usually engaged on all of the issues. Okay, next slide. Just really quickly, just to focus on some of the things that OneRail cares about, so you have a sense of it as I'm talking. We really want to make sure that rail is competitive with all of the other modes, and so essentially, treating rail as we treat our highways and making sure that we don't make it harder to build rail projects, et cetera. We also really focus on safety and jobs because those are two of the highest priorities. And then we advocate for funding and are trying to make the case that passenger and transit service are really part of the climate solution. And so those are our sort of big 5 core issues that we focus on. Okay, next slide. All right, so today I'm going to talk about infrastructure, which is the smaller $1 trillion circle. I'm going to just do some framing right now because it is confusing. The press talks about infrastructure sort of writ large, whether they're talking about the little circle or the bigger circle. And so I just want to do just a little bit of stage setting on what actually passed and what still may pass. So the infrastructure bill, that's the smaller, darker circle. It's approximately 1 trillion. Some say 1.2, but it's over a number of years. So it's around $1 trillion. This is a big deal, sort of by any stretch of the imagination. It is a huge plus up in infrastructure funding and covers a really broad set of infrastructure, but it's the traditional infrastructure that we think about when we say that word. So it's transit and rail and electricity and ports and all of that kind of good, solid infrastructure when we say that word. It was also bipartisan and very excitedly became law this week. The social infrastructure bill also gets referred to as infrastructure in the press, but is not what we traditionally call infrastructure. And so there's a whole host of good issues in there, including some traditional infrastructure as well. So there is transit funding, high-speed rail funding that we're particularly focused on, but there's also climate money that might benefit transit and rail. And so there's a host of programs within that scope too. As everyone knows, that bill is much more up in the air as it's sort of working through the political and legislative process, and it's slow going. So we're still probably a ways away from knowing the true fate of that bill and the specifics about what's in it, but it's an exciting thing down the road that folks are still very, very much engaged in passing. But today, really just going to focus on this hard infrastructure, the traditional infrastructure that we know. Okay, next slide. It's also worth noting in the infrastructure bill, it's really two bills. It is the surface transportation policy bill. That is the basis for all of our infrastructure money. That is how highways and transit have traditionally gotten funded. For anybody that's ever heard Safety Lou and FAST Act, that is the updated version of that. IIJA just like does not have the same ring as any of those other bills. And so we really need some sort of new thing to call it, because it's a mouthful to get IIJA out, but it is the policy bill that sets the policy for surface transportation. It is also excitingly a gigantic plus up of money to targeted areas, including a big influx of money for rail. Okay, next slide. So the 550 billion is the plus up pot. This is the set of funding that is most frequently referred to. People call it $1 trillion bill, and then they only talk about this 550 billion, but it is an important 550 billion. And there is a significant amount. You can see it's almost half of the funding goes to surface transportation, and a large portion of that, which you'll see in another slide here in just a second, is going to rail and transit. Importantly, in that 1 trillion is also that surface transportation reauthorization, which is around 300 billion. Okay, next slide. This is how the bills compare. So the first smaller column that you see, that is what we're currently operating under. That's highway money, transit money, and the little tiny bit of passenger rail money that we authorize or that we appropriate every year is in that column. The House bill is next. It did not become law. The Senate bill is what became law, but I put up both bills just to show you as this bill was moving through, the House put out a really good passenger rail transit focused authorization bill. And rightly so, advocates were pretty excited about that bill. Not everyone in the OneRail coalition was, because there was a lot of policy that not everyone agreed on, but there was a lot of consternation around not incorporating the House bill. But I just wanted to show you, when we're just looking at funding, not talking about policy, when we're just looking at funding, the House bill, which was great, and the Senate bill, which was great, they look a lot alike. They're very similar in terms of the scope of funding that's going out the door. They don't go out in the exact same way, so it's not exactly apples to apples, but it just gives you a good sense that these were, transit and rail were high priorities, and these are big, gigantic jumps from what we've seen traditionally. Okay, next slide. So a couple of things about what's in this bill. This is, I'm going to talk about the rail pieces too, but I did want to take a second to talk about the competitive grants first. This is the single biggest influx of competitive grants that we've seen in forever, that I've ever seen. It is a gigantic increase for what the Department of Transportation is going to be able to dole out through discretion. So they get to pick the winners and the losers. Everyone has to apply, which means we have to get good projects in the pipeline. But what's really exciting in this bill is the shift towards multimodal projects. It's that first issue that I was talking about that OneRail cares about, which is really a sort of leveling of the playing field. We are eligible, Rail is eligible in a host of these programs. So there's a mega projects program, there's Tiger, which has now become Raise. Those all saw gigantic increases. And then the infra freight program, which also has freight rail eligibilities. There are a host of other competitive grants where we will also be eligible around congestion relief and some other climate related programs. But it is an exciting time. It's also going to make things complicated now that we're getting into the implementation phase, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. The rail program. I mean, this is like, we should all be doing cartwheels. This is a really big deal. I mean, Chuck Schumer, quoting President Biden, said at the press announcement that it was a big expletive deal, and it is not everything everyone has ever wanted, right? There are certainly places where people would have liked to see even more funding. There are places where people would have liked to have seen different policy. All of that can be true. And at the same time, this can be like a transformational investment in rail, particularly on the passenger side. And having worked as a Senate staffer, I'm not sorry that I missed all the work associated with drafting this bill, but this is the dream. This would have been the dream bill to write, to have this much dedicated funding for rail that we have never seen before. My partner in crime and I, when we both worked in the Senate together, this was the exact issue that we spent so much time fighting for, and everyone turned us down at every corner. So the fact that in a bipartisan group, these folks were able to come together and incorporate this funding is just, I mean, I was shocked and blown away, and I'm really proud that they were able to keep this funding. I am happy to just flag what the sort of some of the differences between the programs, but big increases for Amtrak, both on the national network side and on the NEC side. The Fed state program is the big deal change for how we're going to fund projects, including high-speed rail type projects. That program, when Fed state was created, it was really a focus on the NEC. That was the intent of the program initially, was to be the federal partner to what the states were adding in along the corridor. That program is massively expanded now and has a whole different focus in terms of being able to impact projects around the country and then also grow service, start new service. This is the program to watch. The hard thing about having a new program like this is it really is going to take DOT some time to implement it. And so there'll be an opportunity to weigh in on sort of how it's structured, but it's also means that it's not going to flow out the door immediately. Chrissy also received a big plus up and was maintained on the policy level during this bill. And then the grade crossing elimination program is a new program. This is not Section 130. 130 is an existing program that usually has a couple, like 100 something million, couple million every year. This is a $3 billion program that's really aimed at the elimination part of grade crossings versus just maybe improvement at crossings. Okay, next slide. So what does this mean for all of you? So for anybody that's interested in the passenger service, I think this is such a great thing to celebrate, and that we really should be celebrating it. I also think it means it's going to take an immense amount of work. So because there is this big influx of rail money, doesn't mean that there's a big influx of rail projects ready to go in terms of the necessary requirements to get out the door. It also doesn't mean that the administration is immediately ready to churn those projects out the door. So just in a normal year, if we wrote a new bill, it solidly takes a year to write the rulemaking. So what do each of the words in the law mean, and what do those eligibility means, and who can apply and how do they apply? And then to put that into the NOFO, get the NOFO out the door and have people apply. It just takes a while, sort of in the normal course of business, to get all of those programs out the door. In addition to just the normal course of business, Congress gave the department so many new programs. It's multiple gigantic discretionary grant pots across modes, and that some of which are hosted in the secretary's office. So everyone is going to have sort of the same pipeline project where you can only get so many of these NOFOs and rulemakings out the door at the same time. It's entirely possible that the department gets creative about how we do that, but I will say it is important for all of us to note that it's not an immediate pipeline of funding coming out the door. They have to do the base work for it. That being said, it also gives us a lot of time. It gives us enough time to make sure that we're building support for the projects that we want to move forward, because the department can only pick the projects from the pool of applicants that they receive. And so making sure that good projects are going into that pipeline will be really critical to making sure that we see great benefits on the flip side. Can you go to the next slide? One of the things I wanted to flag is, even before this bill passed, we were seeing good headlines around passenger rail. This Virginia deal, which will allow Virginia to increase both its commuter and passenger rail service, was a really big deal. And this is the kind of headlines like I hope that we're going to start seeing everywhere. But I did want to flag one of the real reasons why this project came together, and if you can just flip to the next slide, is because of the core of partners that were together. So here it's the state of Virginia, it's the Amtrak, which has the passenger service, CSX, Norfolk Southern, who both have freight service, and then VRE, which is their commuter rail. Having all of those partners come together, DOT is not pictured here, but DOT was also an integral partner. Having all of those partners come together is what allows these kinds of projects to be successful. So the more that we're doing on the front end to bring that group of people together, the better, I think, outcomes we're going to have in terms of being able to see some of these projects move quickly and get good work and construction really moving on the ground. Can you go to the next slide? Just want to flag a couple of quick things. One is OneRail has just done some polling. We released it this week on the same day that the president signed the bill. So you may not have seen it because there's lots of exciting news, but I did want to flag a couple of really important talking points that folks can use, and you should feel free to use them when you're talking about things. But we're continuing to see a high percentage of Americans focused on moving people and freight by rail, and with the express purpose of trying to reduce GHG emissions. And you go to the next slide. Same thing on the highway safety side. This is normally this highway rail grade crossing is our highest polled question. The one before it surpassed it this year, but this continues to be a really big focus around safety. Okay, next. This is an important one. This is how folks view public transit and passenger rail after the pandemic. This saw a multiple point increase from last year. We had good polling last year on this too, but we're continuing to see that folks want to return to rail and transit, and it's really necessary that we have those systems in place for them to return to. And I know you guys are going to have some hard conversations in a minute about what's happening at Amtrak, but this is something we should be really driving home to people, is that this is a service that people want to use, and we need to have good projects in place for them to access it. Next slide. On investing, we had 1 out of 2 Americans believing that we should be investing more, which is great because we just did. And so we're about to see the benefits of that. And then I think this is just the last slide. So one more. This just one last thing to flag is that folks really are highly supportive of freight rail and continue to be, and want to see more goods and services moved on freight rail rather than trucks. One point to note is that in almost every category, men were rating rail more favorably, whether it was passenger or freight. And also, we saw some dips in some of the younger generations in terms of support. They really pushed the various rideshare services as a higher percentage of favorability. And so I think we have some work to do long-term around making sure that our rail systems are supported by the younger generations. All right, Sean, I feel like I threw out a lot of information all at once, but I'm happy to answer questions or talk some specifics.
You did. That was excellent. Thank you again. I think you've actually answered some of the questions in the chat. So I will have to do a little bit of triage here. These are two related questions, and I think it's an important bit to tease out. The first one is David Phillips. Please explain the difference between the 66 billion for rail versus the 102 billion for rail that shows up in our RPA spreadsheet, the funding programs, and those combine both the guaranteed funds and the authorized funds.
Mm.
The other one is from Dave Randall, and he asked, if the Republicans take control of the House and Senate in 2023, will they be able to cancel this authorization? So do you want to talk about kind of the difference between guaranteed and future appropriations and the relationship between?
Yeah, I'll talk about
the gavel.
Yeah, I'll talk about how the money normally works. So normally on the passenger rail side, we authorize the money. And so we might authorize a really large amount of money, but the appropriators have to fund it because we don't have the highway trust fund where it's automatic. We don't set aside a portion of the gas tax for passenger rail. We have to take it out of the general fund, which means that we compete, passenger rail competes every year against everything else that's in the appropriations world. So it's housing and climate and water and a whole host of other priorities. And so even though you might authorize a lot of money, you aren't guaranteed that money. And so that's sort of the sad part every year is we write these big bills and then we can't get them fully funded because there's only so much money in the appropriations world. That is different this year because the bipartisan group plussed up and provided advanced money. So that's what the 66 billion is. That is advanced money that isn't guaranteed over the course of the 5 years for for rail generally. That is the first time that has happened. We did have 8 billion in ARA for rail, but this is the first time we've seen all the core programs sort of receive this plus up advanced appropriations. And it's something we advocates have been fighting for a very long time, including RPA. And so it's big kudos to everyone that that funding is in here and guaranteed for the next 5 years. Was there a second part? Did I answer that?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think that does answer it. And I guess the answer to the second question is we don't know what will happen with future rounds of appropriations and control the committees. And
I'd say because the Senate is 50-50, we're in such a unique position with the Senate, and the fact that a bipartisan group came together to put that funding into place, it's not out of the question, it's just unlikely. You would have to see gigantic shifts in both majorities for people to take apart to dismantle that deal. Could they play around the edges? Yes, and in fact they might, but it would be really hard since we had this core group of senators in a bipartisan manner agree to those funding levels. It would be challenging to get the votes to dismantle it.
So, and you touched on this a little bit, but there are kind of set asides for the different business lines. So maybe it's worth teasing out, but how does this bill help folks who don't live on the coast?
On the coast or on the East Coast?
Well, I think it's a good question because people don't often think about California as a hotbed of Amtrak activity, but 3 of the top 5 routes are there by ridership. But yeah, let's go flyover countries specifically. Yeah,
so it gives you a big opportunity to add new service. It also gives an opportunity to get new rail cars. I mean, I'm most excited about that folks have been working on having all of these new rail cars forever, and it sort of felt like a pipe dream to get it done. Like it felt like we were going to be working on it for the next decade or so. And so having this big influx of money, I think will really sort of change the passenger experience, and hopefully it's a vastly improved passenger experience. And then for all the folks, there's a ton of work. I mean, and you all know this and are part of it, but there's a ton of work in the Midwest and in other parts of flyover country that want new rail service. And so this is that first opportunity to to have access to planning money, to have access to implementation money, hopefully with reconciliation, which is this second sort of bite at the apple. There might even be additional high-speed rail money. So there are real opportunities for everyone to see a growth in service.
Yeah, great point. And there are those set asides, 45% for non-NEC, 20% of that, which from the Fed state grant program, 20% of that 45% has to go to something that benefits long distance. So
and this is a real balance. Long distance is sort of in its heyday, or like, people are excited about it and are really protecting it on both sides of the aisle. That has not always been the case. And we've always had support. We sort of haven't had this level and outward sort of outcry for support for those services. And so I'm really excited about what that means long-term for those services, because there is this, we've really bolstered the folks in Congress, particularly in the Senate, who are supporting those services.
Definitely. I'm going to take a little bit of preference staff preference here to just ask a question that for you as someone who worked in Congress, how important is it for us as passengers, as advocates, been working for this for so long, to turn around and thank members of Congress, to thank the staffers who we've been working with for 5, 6, sometimes 40 years for many of the people in this chat, to thank them for passing this historic bill? I mean,
yes, like we should just, everyone who voted for this bill should be profusely thanked. It is important. They need to hear it. They need to know that folks in their district and in their states really care about the money. And that also helps protect it in the future. So if you're worried that the House might flip, or that someone might try to cancel the money or send the money back, those are the kinds of things that can help insulate that from happening, is really building that robust support for the funding. And now that there is this big pot of funding, there are likely to be challenges along the way. And so making sure that we're communicating how important it is to work through those challenges and get this funding out the door is going to be critical too. So absolutely start by thanking them, and then really stick with the support as we work through the hard part of getting money actually out the door and onto the tracks.
Perfect. And I believe we'll end on one final question. You've been very generous with your time. Apologies. And I think we have a question here from Steve Strauss, which is, can we expect the projects listed in Amtrak's FY22 legislative grant request to kind of compromise that first tranche of funding coming out of, I suppose, both Amtrak from direct grants, but also the US DOT discretionary programs? You touched on that a little bit, but I do think the spend plan is important.
Do I wish I had a crystal ball on how the money is going to get spent? Like, absolutely, yes. I think the good news is FRA is already in the process and has been for a while now of starting this groundwork about how they're going to get the funding out the door. What do the various provisions mean? There are also policy provisions that it will impact how the funding goes out and what it goes to. And so we've already heard that they are sort of actively preparing materials and a website to make sure everyone has a transparent view into how those projects are being selected. I think there's a likelihood, but I'm glad I don't have to make the decision, but I'm happy to support them as they work through it.
Yeah, that's important. It's an important reminder that this all takes time, and it's not going to flip overnight. I think there's a 180-day, which is equivalent to 6 months deadline for the US DOT to kind of produce a spend plan for FY22. So we will definitely share all those resources that Devon mentioned. Thank you again. Please follow OneRail both on Twitter and Facebook. They're a font of great information. And Devon obviously knows her stuff. You can see it right here. Thank you again, Devon. I think at this point, unless there's any closing comments from you, Devon, we will switch over.
No, I'll just flag that your voices are definitely heard and continue to be desperately needed. And you guys all do such great work that that I'm sure that you will be very active on this next part, but excited to be part of it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Devon. So we're going to turn over. Joe, can we get the next slide? By the way, that was really, I mean, I'm sure everyone understands what an excellent presentation that was. I learned a lot, and I think it lays a really nice blueprint for those kind of near-term opportunities. Now, there's also some near-term operational challenges facing us for the Amtrak, as Amtrak passengers, as Amtrak served communities. It's been a tight labor market. There was a number of furloughs and layoffs that happened as a result of COVID-19. We had an opinion about them. I won't step on Jim's presentation here, but there are some near-term challenges we do need to, at the same time as we're celebrating this historic bill, think about responding to and think about pressing both Congress and Amtrak on. Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, just please enter your questions in the sideline. And thank you again, Jim.
Thanks, Sean. First, before I jump into this, I'm going to just add my thanks to our friend Devon. I don't think a lot of our members recognize or appreciate the value of the partnership that we have with OneRail and working with Devon and Liz and everybody else. It's really, we have great allies, helpful allies, and powerful allies, and a lot of that is because of the work that OneRail has done, and honestly, work that Devon is spearheading too. So, just personally, thank you for being here and letting us show off to the rest of our membership what a terrific partnership we have with OneRail, because you guys are terrific. Okay, next slide, Joe, please. So here's where we're at. We've got $66 billion to spend to expand and make everything big. And in the meantime, we have a tight labor market and vaccination hesitancy. We need people to spend that money, and we need people to run the trains. And between the furloughs and layoffs that happened at the height of the pandemic, Amtrak has not been able to fill a lot of those positions as they try to return the service to the pre-pandemic levels. And this was something I warned in my Senate testimony last year was a possibility. And I urged folks at the time to find the money to kind of keep everybody in place, because we anticipated that this was going to be a problem. And here we are, it is a problem. This has been complicated by, not completely driven by, but complicated by the vaccine requirement for federal contractor employees. Absent a religious or medical exemption by December 8th, everyone has to have their COVID vaccine. And Amtrak has been warning that given the uneven distribution of personnel and vaccination rates, some services may see temporary service reductions. Well, that's a mouthful. What does that actually mean? Well, what it means is that there are places in the country where there are enough folks kind of on the bench, if you will, that there would be not as much disruption. There are places in the country where the bench is thin, and all it would require is one or two folks to decline to be compliant, and now you don't have enough folks to crew the train. So it's very uneven, and it's a very difficult situation for them to deal with. So they're doing their best. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. But again, first I would like to give you a little context. Joe, next slide. So I wrote this on October 28th for everybody. This was right after the August numbers came out on what we're calling the Great Resignation. I'm pointing this out just because this is not a problem that is unique to Amtrak. We are 6 months in a row for record-setting levels of Americans quitting the workforce, just throwing in the towel. My blog in October was about the August numbers. The September numbers came out just last week. 4.4 million Americans quit their jobs in September. And it's worth it to dig down a little further into the accommodation and hospitality workforce These are those sort of public-facing hospitality types of roles. 7% of that workforce threw in the towel in September, and it was about 6.8% in August. So this is a big phenomenon, and it is more than just Amtrak. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, this is where you can get this data. This is from the Federal Reserve. They track all of this kind of stuff. And it's fascinating to look at what they call quits. You can go look at this yourself. It's hosted at the St. Louis Fed. So it's fred.stlouisfed.org. It's a great site and lots of good data, but it's also very sobering to look at that spike and see what's happening. So again, I say this just so we understand the environment in which Amtrak is struggling to recruit folks, get them trained, get them in the door, bring people back from furlough, and so forth. This is a wide scale phenomenon. Next slide, please. So we are in touch with Amtrak leadership. I'm in touch with Amtrak leadership a lot. This is not a kind of grand ceremony that we do once a year or twice a year. We've been in constant contact, trying to understand some of these questions. What is the status? Where is the workforce? How likely is it that we will see service cuts? When is Amtrak going to make an announcement on schedule cuts? Which routes? When are we going to know as customers? When are we going to be notified? When will Amtrak stop taking reservations if it looks like they're going to have to enact some service cuts on trains? Are there any specific steps on improvements in labor retention, new hiring? We're just kind of trying to take the pulse. And so we continue to ask those questions. We continue to be in touch with the management team. And they have been very candid with us. And in part, it's because I have been able to assure them of some confidentiality. So they do share with us where they're at with some confidentiality. And that I think is a worthwhile trade, because it helps us to continue to advocate for passengers' needs in this process. Next slide, please. I do want to before I jump into some of the questions, I do want to point out that Amtrak is trying very, very, very hard to avoid service cuts. It is hard to describe to you all how hard they are working to avoid this, but they are trying very, very hard. And a lot of people are sort of crossing their fingers that maybe we won't get to this sort of ultimate step of service cuts, but it really depends on individuals' behavior. And one of the things that I said in my blog post was, for all of you that are out there riding the trains, we're out of policy levers to pull, right? I mean, you just saw this great presentation from Devon. We've got the money, we've got Republicans on board, we've got Democrats on board, we've got the White House signing the bill. Everything is there, all the pieces are in place. And now we have to make sure people want to come to work. The only thing we have left as passengers at this point to do is, when you're on the train, thank those folks. When you interact with them, make sure they know, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here. I know this is a difficult time. Thank you for being here so that I can take this train, so I can see my grandmother, or I can see my grandkids, or whatever it is. Let them know that they are appreciated and that what they're doing is essential to you. That personal touch might just be the thing that takes someone who's on the fence and pushes them over the line. So let's, I guess let's do some questions, Sean.
Thank you. Sorry about that. All right, so we have some pre-submitted questions. And if there's anything else, feel free to type them up in the chat box. Again, as Jim made clear, we're not going to be able to provide many route or regional level specifics. We're still waiting on that, but let's get into some of the general issues. So one of the first ones we got was, would the labor shortage require Amtrak to take on people with less experience? And how would that affect Amtrak's safety near term and medium term?
Well, look, for one thing, Amtrak is just not going to cut corners on the safety piece of this. And that's something that, frankly, if anyone were to ask us to advocate for anything like that, we would decline. We are 100% behind the idea of staffing up, but staffing up safely. And what that means is, for a locomotive engineer, for example, it could take over a year or more to qualify as a locomotive engineer, to qualify on a particular territory. That is how the system stays safe. You can't cut corners on something like that. And so at the same time, we would love to start to fill that Amtrak hiring pipeline with a new generation of people that are eager to bring train travel to the rest of the country. So we can accommodate both things. But we want to make sure that the workforce that is there comes back to work, comes back safely, and that they're supported, so that we can take advantage of this incredible bill that's been written. That honestly, we helped in that process, as did many of our partners. We want to see this come to fruition, and that means they're going to have to take on new staff. So that's kind of where they're at. And we would not support anything that diminished safety or cutting corners to bring folks on.
All right, thank you. Dave Randall asked a good question, which is, seems like those quitting are in lower paying jobs. Amtrak operations are higher pay. Is there a way that Amtrak might incentivize greater worker retention or hiring by offering higher pay?
That's a tough one, because in a lot of cases, these are agreement employees. And so a lot of what you can do for them is dependent on the outlines of whatever labor agreement they're operating under. So that's kind of a tough one. Around the margins, there are some efforts that I know about to try to incentivize some folks. But there's a saying, the kind of physics is the same for everybody, and there are certain immovable realities. You can't just pluck a locomotive engineer out of, say, Philadelphia and drop him or her into Montana and say, run the train. It's just not possible, even if that person wanted to, and even if you wanted to pay them a bonus to move. So a lot of this it has to be done on an individual basis. It has to be done on finding those folks that maybe were in a different territory, moved for some reason, see if they want to come back. It is literally managing individual by individual, which is an enormous challenge for an organization the size of Amtrak. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do.
I'm glad you touched on the labor agreement there. I know when we've been talking with local operators in California, for instance, that they have often felt sometimes that their ability to offer higher wages, because cost of living is higher in those areas, has been restricted by these kind of national labor agreements. And so that is an important restrictive fact of life that Amtrak has to deal with. Jim, I think this tees up a very nice bit of the conversation we had with Amtrak, which is regarding hiring procedures. And this is, I don't have a name here. My son with a BA degree has applied for a couple of positions online. It seems that those applications fall into a black hole. He's gotten no response. Seems improvements in human resources are necessary.
That is interesting, because that does touch on one of the conversations we've had with Amtrak as recently as yesterday, but we had it the previous week as well. Amtrak is staffing up just generally in response to the Jobs Act. But the very first thing they had to do, and this is going to sound a little odd, but they had to hire people in order to hire people. And what do I mean by that? They needed to boost the HR department, the human resources staffing, to manage this process and create the intake that's required. A lot of the HR folks took the buyout during the height of the pandemic, when Amtrak was offering the buyout to some of the employees. So they had to kind of rebuild that HR function just to be able to reconstruct and refill that pipeline of other positions. So that's kind of it's an unfortunate kind of situation, but that's where they were at. The HR folks, at least, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding from yesterday was that that the HR side is kind of back up to speed now, so we can start to see some movement in the rest of those positions.
Yeah, my understanding was that they said it was kind of one of those things where we have to build up the capacity to review a greater number of candidates. So we focused HR's efforts on hiring more HR. And so again, it's one of those things where, like so many parts of this bill, it's going to be capacity building, because you can't go from starvation, uneven funding year to year, where you have no predictability, to all of a sudden becoming a well-oiled machine. Stephen Ferrari, I guess, had just a good point here. And it's in California, we still have engineers and conductors that have moved to California to work on corridor services that have better daytime working hours. So some will move for better conditions. I think that's just important to kind of note that these are demanding jobs, and especially for a lot of long distance trains, it's not just show up from 9 to 5 and go home to bed.
These are well-paying jobs, but they're also very hard jobs. You are away from home a lot. You are, people. I think I think it's a shame that some people look at a dining car person, for example, as a waiter. Well, maybe that's what they're doing at the moment that you're getting served a meal, but they're doing a lot more than that. They're simultaneously running a restaurant. They're moving at 79 miles an hour. They're doing it from city to city. They're doing it away from home. Imagine what it would be like if you had to go work at the local Denny's for 4 days straight and sleep there. These are hard jobs. And so there are folks that would be willing to relocate. There are people who have already relocated for other roles. And as I said, in some cases, you can move people around relatively easily, but depending on the craft and the type of certification that's required, it's not an instant process. So even if you want to move those puzzle pieces around, it can't happen necessarily as quickly as anyone would like. And again, for taking in the new folks, there's a training procedure, there's a drug screen, there's hoops that are unavoidable that you can't make go away. And until recently, Amtrak did not have enough people to even handle that intake process. So I think we'll see that improve here in the coming weeks and months.
Well, I think the last two questions here, Jim. One is for John, Morgan, Christoph. And is there any indication that hiring is a short-term problem or a long-term problem? I.e., if we're looking at potential service cuts just when the vaccine goes into effect, or whether this will be a longer-term issue in terms of how we staff up additional frequencies.
I wish I knew the answer to that. There's certainly a short-term way out of this. If the vaccine uptake and compliance with the rules and regulations gets high enough, I think Amtrak can sidestep the service cuts. I think everybody is hoping for that. Everybody is crossing their fingers on that. I know that Amtrak is literally looking at it day by day so that they can kind of wait until that last second of that last minute of that last hour before midnight before really having to sort of pull the trigger on any cuts. And so we're waiting every day for people to come in and say, yes, here's my card. Yes, I took care of it. I think everyone is hoping to sort of push that down the road as far as they possibly can. If people step up and do the right thing and they get compliant, we can avoid the service cuts. Then yes, I think we will still have an issue staffing up for the expansion that is in the Jobs Act, but we'll be in a much better place. But trying to do this after service cuts, I think would delay the process tremendously. And I think it would be a terrible, terrible thing to happen to passenger rail at a moment that frankly, all of us have been working for decades to get to this time when we have the political support, we have the money, we have everything in place, all the pieces in place to really be successful and really transform passenger rail. And we can't get the folks to staff the trains. we would be missing an opportunity of multiple generations if we can't get this done. So I wish I could tell you what the real answer is. All I can say is that there's a short-term fix, which is people doing the right thing. Over the long term, I think that, or medium term, I'll say, I think the Great Resignation has certainly turned out to be a real phenomenon. But I also think that folks that are disillusioned with some of those jobs that are involved in sort of the Great Resignation might find working on the railroad to be very rewarding and fulfilling. It is kind of a fun thing to do. You do get to travel, you do get to meet people, you do get good benefits, it does pay well. And if you can absorb that kind of lifestyle where you're on the road a lot, it's a great place to be. So I think that it may turn out to be more attractive here in the coming months, as long as we can keep the service intact long enough for people to train up and take their spots on the railroad.
Yep. Thank you for that. The last one, and I think I'm going to combine two questions here, which is the first one is from Penny, and it's, can you hazard guess as to what kind of lead time Amtrak might provide for service alterations? And then another one from Steve, which is, isn't it better to have cancellations here and there like the airlines do than to have full schedule cuts to a tri-weekly schedule?
Well, I mean, let's do the second question first. One of the reasons why, if you go in right now with reservations, you haven't seen any changes is precisely for that reason. The management team is doing everything they can, going from crew base to crew base, line item by line item, person by person, trying to figure out how to plug all these things in, tracking the vaccination rates, the compliance rates, all the time, practically in real time as it's available, to try to avoid that. And so again, the idea is not to just take the entire system and go 3 times a week. The idea is to be thoughtful and targeted and tactical, and look at only those things that you must do, where you have no choice, where you just don't have the humans to run the train. We won't really know what that is until we get closer to the December 8th deadline. As I said, I think everyone is kind of waiting for that last group of folks to come in the door and change the number. And so we won't really know, honestly, until we get a lot closer to that December 8th deadline. If everything works right, we may just dodge the bullet. And I think that's what everyone is hoping for.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning that Amtrak took the right course of action and ensured that they would be operating at full capacity for Thanksgiving holiday break, which is obviously the big travel week of the year. If they had, I think, followed things by the book, we would have already started to see some service alterations, but wiser heads prevailed and said, no, we have to be at capacity for the Super Bowl of intercity transportation. Jim, is there any words you want to close on before we throw it to Joe?
I think we could keep going for another hour on the Great Resignation. All I will say is I will just kind of foot stomp my message to all of you when you're out riding the trains here in the next few days, approaching that deadline. Let people know that we're glad they're there. Make sure they know that they're valued and that we really need them there. That you need them there to make your trip happen. You need them there to make your essential travel happen. Let them know they're appreciated. Make sure they know that if they decide not to come to work, that they're affecting a lot of people, particularly now when we have worked for so long to get to a place where passenger rail may finally get the place in the American society that it deserves. We shouldn't be snatching the football away from ourselves. And that's kind of where we're at. So just a strong, encouraging word to all those folks that you encounter on the train. As I said, when they're trying to make that decision and maybe they're on the fence, maybe they've had a bad couple days, having a customer thank them, be appreciative. If it's in a tipped kind of position, give them a good tip. Make them feel like they're valued, recognize that they do work hard and that we do care about them and that we want them there and that we need them there.
Excellent. Thank you again to Jim. Thank you again to Devon. Thanks for everyone for showing up. I'm going to throw it over to Joe with some closing thoughts.
Well, thank you, Sean. And once again, I want to thank Devon, Jim, and Sean for a fantastic presentation. I know there was a lot of information to get through, and I want to touch on two quick things. One, something that Devon and Sean talked about is thanking our elected officials, thanking our members of Congress for getting this bill passed. And I'm going to add a website in the chat real quick. railpassengers.org/action will take you to our action center where we have a food and beverage survey, things like that. But there is a link for you to send your members of Congress who voted for the bill a thank you, a note of thanks, and a spot for you to add your own personal message to their staff or to their offices for your thank you, and for what it means to you to have this funding through. But as I say that, I also want to make sure that every one of you here on this webinar take a bow. For every one of you over the last years who have sent an email, a text, a tweet, made a phone call, had a meeting. This wasn't just this year, as Jim mentioned before. This is decades in the making for a lot of you, a lot of us. And I just want to make sure that you all take your bow as well, because we could not have done this without your help. We are a mighty staff, a small staff, but mighty, but still without our volunteers, we really can't, have not seen this through. That said, our next event, we are going to shut down the webinars until the end of until next year. So our next event, for those of you who attended the fall conference, we did a small Wednesday 2-hour presentation, just open office hours. We are going to unfortunately have to limit that, because over 2 hours, if we let 500 people in, we could staff could be talking for days. So it will be limited. We will let you know the details after Thanksgiving right away. That's going to be happening on Tuesday, December 7th. For a couple hours for you guys to join on Zoom. We're going to have separate rooms for all our staffers, for John Z, Jim, Sean, Madison, and myself, for just to come talk about policy, about membership, about fund, for whatever we're doing at the association, for you to come by and talk to us. Also, for those of you who want to rewatch this, remember railpassengers.org/webinars for all of our events in the past. And I would be remiss if I didn't sort of hype up our store. So many of you have purchased our seen even the dining car French toast shirts, our limited National Rail Day, and our softball shirt for the summer. Just like last year when we kicked off our store, we are doing a 2-week only, where it's going to end on Cyber Monday, the Monday after Thanksgiving. But we're bringing back our I'd rather be on the train design. Unfortunately, I get a lot of emails. We don't have bumper stickers yet. We are working on that. We are trying to find companies that can work with us. But for the meantime, please help us. This is fundraising. We are a nonprofit. This is helping us, keep doing what we're doing. Like I said, limited. It's only for the holidays. Get it out there. Buy your loved ones, buy your fellow advocates a shirts, and we will see you after the holidays. Please have a safe Thanksgiving, and we will be talking to you on our next day, which is our office hours. Sorry.
Take care, everybody. Buy a shirt.
Yes, listen to Jim, buy a shirt. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful holiday.